question answer session starts. I request Sri Sunil Parekh to moderate the session. Sri Sunil Parekh.
Friends, I think it's a treat to know that, interactions with China have really taken such deep roots. And contrary to the model that we had, that China is a very difficult place to go for manufacturing and they are masters of manufacturing. People are exporting from here manufactured goods. People are going there to manufacture goods. So the reality seems to be quite different from the myth that is there. And my goodness, I think the number of questions I've got is like a book list today. It's a lot of interest has been generated. We have ample amount of time to address some of these questions. And I think we will do justice on a lot of other aspects that could not be covered in the talk are now likely to, come out into the open. And therefore, let me begin. Some are related to the development of China as a country and as a model. Are there lessons to be learned from us, for us, from there? Is it a sustainable model? Are they doing well on the environmental front? How inclusive is their development? Is it focused only on the eastern coast, or they are looking at their interior also in a balanced way? For example, we can't take in India a view that we will develop the coast and forget about the interior, something that only they can do under their system. So on the broader aspects of development, could I request both the speakers to reflect upon, in general, on the issues of environment, inclusive development, and what is the future in terms of China's economic growth potential? Ambassador Gopinathan, if you'd like to take the mic and address some of these points.
Thank you very much. I think this probably is again something for research projects of not one lifetime but several lifetimes. It's not something which you can encapsulate in 3 minutes or 5 minutes, but let me make an attempt. I think as development models are concerned, probably, is it coming through? Yeah. Okay. As far as development models are concerned, I think if we look back, the Chinese appear to have had an initial advantage in terms of the politico-economic system that they adopted after 1949, when they became when they adopted the political system that's prevalent today. Because under that, for brevity's sake, if you call it the socialist system or the communist system, they could address inequalities much faster than we could under the system that we adopted from 1951. And perhaps by the time they launched their massive economic liberalization program under Deng Xiaoping in 1978-79, one could perhaps assert that the Chinese could establish a base in terms of addressing poverty and abject deprivation far more solidly than we had been able to in the comparable period. I'm not trying to generalize, I'm not trying to make too sweeping generalizations and remarks. These are all subject to qualifications and criticism, and one can always nitpick. But in overall broad terms, I think the Chinese had already dealt with and overcome the most abject forms of poverty and deprivation by the time they launched their liberalization program in 1978. Whereas if you looked at India in 1991, when we started our liberalization program, I think the inequalities were still very much pervasive. So I think that is something which we need to constantly keep in mind when we start comparing where we are. Is it a race? Can we race? Can we overcome? Can we overtake them? Can we, be as good as them? I think that 15-year gap, there is already a 15-year gap, but more important than the gap, as Mrs. Das said, the baselines were different. The baselines from where we started were different already. I think that is something which we need to keep in mind. Second, you mentioned the environment.
Yes. Sustainability.
Sustainability. Once again, the kind of models or the kind of systems which we have, I think impact us differently. In our case, when we know or when we have become conscious that we have to deal with the aspects of environmental protection and address sustainability issues, I think the government has been making efforts to address these questions. But there are, again, constraints. I'm not trying to get into value judgments whether this is good, that is better, this is bad, that is worse. I mean, that's something which we can always discuss endlessly. But look at our own systems. The government tries to address a particular issue by a particular legislative process, frames rules and regulations, notifies them. The next day somebody goes to court. There is a stay order. I mean, these are all very good. I'm not trying to say that the courts are an obstacle to environment protection. On the contrary, the courts have always probably been, judicial activism has helped us in environmental protection. But if you looked at China, perhaps judicial activism has not played such an important role in environmental protection. So there are pluses and minuses on both sides. If let's say the central government or one of the state governments decides to put up a hydroelectric plant, in our case, the average time taken may be, let's say, 10 years. In the case of China, probably it's 2 years. Because again, by an executive fiat, by a decision of the highest policy-making bodies, they can make a decision, they can implement it in the shortest possible time. Whereas in our case, people will run to courts, there will be allegations of displacement of large numbers of people, etc., etc., etc. So, again, the models are somewhat different. It does not mean that one is not able to address them at all, or one is able to address them completely. That's not again the case. But the roadmaps which we are adopting are different, with different consequences for the kind of options that we are exercising. We have an active civil society in our case. I don't know how far the civil society in China is very active, or how much control there is on the civil society. So there are different parameters, there are different variables, there are different dynamics. That's something which we need to be aware. But having said this, if you take an issue like climate change, I think both India and China have been addressing issues of climate change, have been trying to reduce emissions to the extent that we can, because after all we are societies which have per capita incomes of the order, of course China is now probably 4 times or so our per capita income. I mean, we might have started off almost at the same levels, but I think we have barely crossed $1,000 per capita in nominal terms. Chinese are probably around $5,000 to $6,000 per capita more.
Yes.
There are around $4,500 to $5,000 per capita. So even then, we are nowhere near $55,000, $60,000 per capita like the Scandinavians or the many of the European countries. So we are in a situation where growth is still the paramount concern. Growth is still the overriding objective. So in spite of that, we have been addressing climate change issues. In spite of that, we have been trying to improve energy efficiency. In spite of that, we have been trying to resort more to renewables rather than purely fossil fuels. So what is the fashionable word today? Work in progress. It's still a work in progress, that's what I would say. Thank you.
Sustainability is work in progress. I would like to, Ms. Das also to reflect on what is the situation of industrial pollution. How is China able to manage this large industrialization that have taken place effectively from the point of view of pollution mitigation and control?
Yeah, as Ambassador Gopinathan said, it's very difficult to, it's really meant for a thesis. But whatever little we have seen from our experience, one is it is very difficult to generalize. You see, most of the heavy industries is in north of China, which are generally speaking where you say that the air is so polluted. In fact, in Beijing itself, there's constant complaint about the air quality. Compared to that, you look at eastern China, where again it's very heavily industrialized because they started growth early. People are conscious, so the air quality in that sense is different. I just want to say 2 little things. One is that every year the general policy making system that is there, which is when the NPC or the CPPCC meets, they come up with policy decisions. Now for the last several years, environmental protection has been very high on the agenda in terms of government policy, in terms of cities policy, in terms of statements which come out of the official system, that environmental protection is an absolute necessity. We have to do it. There was, I think, I forget whether it was 2010 or 2011, there was the carbon intensity directive which was there, and the target was December. And companies were asked to, you have to meet this carbon intensity deadline by this date. And it was very difficult. I mean, day after day, one read in the papers complaints from the companies that how can we meet this very difficult target. But they had to meet the target. It was simply a target which was said they had to meet it. What a new thing which has happened is that, you know, Chinese are very active on the internet. Even though the traditional social media like Facebook and Twitter is not available, there is QQ, there is Weibo, and almost everybody has a Weibo account. Every government department has a Weibo account. You have to answer. If you get a question on Weibo, you have to answer. You have to put your policy on the public space. And people have become very conscious. Ambassador Gopinathan mentioned about civil society. It's actually, you know, one little message on the Weibo that so and so factory I saw today, I was walking, I saw this factory emitting yellow liquid. This will go viral within half an hour. And immediate corrective action has to be taken. There are several industrial proposals which had to be scrapped in the last few months because of protest by people and you know, massive protest by people. They said we are not going to get killed by these industries anymore. So the consciousness and the impact that social media is playing in activating, in getting people together, and you know, that has a major change that at least I, in a very personal sense, saw, and in which there had been backtracking also on certain projects which were simply scrapped or moved outside the city. In terms of policy, it is also a sort of a policy pronouncement that China needs to now move on in the value chain. And for cities like Shanghai, you know, the moving up on value chain means that the present priorities are financial sector and logistics. These are the two sectors on which Shanghai wants to specialize, and the cultural sector. So which means the polluting industry, because China was also the, you know, Bao Steel is very well known all over the world as a big steel makers. So they are all being pushed out of the city into the periphery. And the city, air quality, city, the livelihood in the city, having green technologies in the city, and making the city livable for people who are in the financial and logistics sector is a very important priority, and government really sort of puts its act together and does that.
Thank you. I think that's a very good image of a changing China, you know. Another question is with regard to intellectual property rights in China. Okay. Parimal Karani, IIT Bombay. And this is related to the fact that many Western multinationals are now apprehensive of setting up engineering plants in China, having had the experience of Chinese copying and out-manufacturing them in no time. Is this something that, you know, Infosys or L&T or many of our Indian companies who are locating there are also worried about, or not really?
Not really. I have, you know, all our companies are there. Let's forget about Indian companies. Just look at the amount of European SMEs who are in China. And SMEs come only with niche technologies. They will come in with a technology which is not available. Any city in the industrial belt you go, you will find at least 20 to 30 German companies, 10 to 15 Italian companies operating there. Only in the eastern China region of Shanghai, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, which are the three provinces which were under I had very direct knowledge of, there were 30,000 Korean companies. You won't come there if there is such a major problem of intellectual property, and especially not an SME. A big company in MNC can hire the top lawyers, and you know, they will get that necessary protection that they need. But SMEs don't have that wherewithal. And you know, there are n number of Swiss companies, Germans, Italians, they're all there manufacturing from China.
We have Harshit Shah of SPIPA right there, and we have B.N. Joshi, right sir, and we have Mr. Y.B. Patel, Deputy Secretary in the Government of Gujarat. All of them have raised several issues on little commercial, but mainly on the aspect of the nexus between China and Pakistan, and the problem that we have in terms of having a big neighbor on the north and a so-called neighbor on the west who is not so friendly with us. And what does it imply for the military dimension? And do we need to be wary of this development? Do we need to be careful? Do we need to factor it in some way? What is your perception, your personal view on this, sir?
Sorry, thank you very much. Once again, questions which can require devotion of lifetimes for preparing thesis rather than answer in three sentences or 3 minutes. I don't know whether it came out clearly in my presentation. I did mention that in the last decade or so, what has become much clearer than before is how to live in a world where competition and cooperation coexist. I would start off from there. In earlier days, let's say in the 50s or the 60s, and immediately after the Second World War, during the Cold War period, it was very easy to distinguish times of peace and times of conflict. I think that has become much more diffuse now. Of course, our dear neighbor contributed to it by the famous proxy war from 1989 onwards. This whole business of subverting a part of India through terrorism, exporting terrorism, infiltration, etc., etc. That was one way of a kind of no war, no peace situation. I mean, nobody could describe it as an actual conflict. At the same time, one could not say that Jammu and Kashmir was peaceful. So there was that kind of thing. I think a similar thing one could say in terms of what is happening today in other fields or other ways. With many countries, and I'll come to China and Pakistan separately, we have situations where rivalries or competition coexists with cooperation. You look at US and China, the best example today probably. I mean, in many ways, in many areas, they are very strong rivals. But at the same time, they